Welcome, and thank you for joining me for the defense of my dissertation, which is titled The Use of a Short Cycle Formative Assessment Observation Protocol to Investigate Alignment Between Secondary Science Teachers' Beliefs and Practices, an Instrumental Case Study. I'm Joey Tedeschi, and my wonderful advisor is Dr. Sarah Pratt. So, the underlying problem that's really driving my research has to do with the centralized focus of standardized testing in the United States and how that is actually impacting secondary science educators' instructional practices. So, many secondary science educators have described a kind of disconnect or cognitive dissonance between their beliefs on what science education should look like and what they find themselves actually doing in the classroom. So, although current research does address standardized testing pressures, there's a deficiency as to how science educator assessment perceptions align with their teaching beliefs and practices. So, the trajectory for the literature review really stemmed from the theoretical framework that I used for this study, which was Kirshner's cross disciplinary framework. So, I separated it out into four sections. So, we had epistemology, pedagogy, assessment, and teacher perceptions. So, what Kirshner was saying from an epistemological standpoint is that embedded within learning theories are different approaches to instruction that really help shape an educator's pedagogy. So, for example, a behaviorist approach might be most effective if the end goal is for students to memorize some facts or learn some skills. So, there's a lot of repetition involved with that. From a constructivist standpoint, the main goal might be for students to be constructing their own knowledge and acquiring conceptual understanding. And then from a sociocultural standpoint, the main goal might be for students to develop a certain disposition within the classroom. Literature on pedagogy suggested that inquiry based instructional strategies are best at promoting conceptual understanding. However, direct instruction can be effective for teaching key points. Literature on assessment suggested that summative and formative assessments are very different, with summative assessments functioning as an accountability measure of achievement, and formative assessment requires the use of feedback to adapt instruction that will mitigate a gap in student understanding. Literature on teacher perceptions suggests that many science educators are experiencing a disconnect between their beliefs and practices. So many of them would like to implement more inquiry based instructional strategies, but they find themselves pressured to teach to the test and find themselves engaging in more rote memorization. So, the purpose of this qualitative instrumental case study was to thoroughly explore a secondary science educator's epistemological beliefs, experiences, and pedagogical practices concerning chemistry assessment in a high school classroom. So, really, the study aimed to investigate the congruence between teacher beliefs and practices through the use of formative assessment enactment within the classroom. So, ideally, through this research, science educators as well as administrators will be able to gain some insight as to why a shift away from high stakes testing towards short cycle formative assessment is necessary to promote congruence between epistemology and pedagogy and also enhance student conceptual understanding and knowledge construction. The central research question for the study was, how does investigating science educator assessment perceptions provide insight into the alignment between their beliefs and practices? So to do that, we really had the cross-disciplinary framework and Assess Today come together to inform the research question. So really we used Assess Today as a tool to inform where an educator's learning goal, learning theory, and instructional practices are currently sitting within the cross-disciplinary framework. Then having the educational professionals reflect on the alignment of the teacher's epistemological beliefs and pedagogical practices to provide an answer to that question. So the theoretical framework I used for this study was Kirshner's cross-disciplinary framework. If we look at the table to the right, it basically shows that there's three main learning metaphors. So there's habituation, construction, and enculturation. And within each learning metaphor, there should be alignment among what is obtained, the learning theory, as well as the pedagogical practices involved. So Kirshner wasn't saying that one learning theory is better than another. Instead, he was saying educators should have alignment among what is obtained, the learning theory, and the pedagogy or the instructional practices. So, for example, habituation, what is obtained would be skills, and that comes out of the learning theory behaviorism. So, from a pedagogical perspective, we should see instructional practices focusing on proficiency with routine exercises um, or repetitive practice. So, construction would be focusing on students building knowledge of concepts. And this would be using elements of constructivism to do that. So, some practices we might see in the classroom from a pedagogical perspective would be things such as conceptual restructuring, perhaps a lecture or discussion where students are actively building knowledge and applying it to new scenarios. And then finally, enculturation, dispositions are what's being obtained. So perhaps like a growth mindset. The learning theory coming out of that would be sociocultural theory. And some of the pedagogy we would see would be some modeling or coaching and culturally appropriate participation within the classroom by students. So the methodology of this case was grounded in qualitative research, specifically in instrumental case study. And I chose this as an instrumental case study to explore Erica's case, as I thought that would give me the best chance of answering that research question. So exploring her beliefs and practices and how they align over time. So the participants for this case included Erica, who is a teacher participant, as well as Joey, who is a researcher participant that facilitated the debriefs in accordance with the Assess Today observation protocol. So data collection really had three parts. It started with a pre-interview to gain insight into Erica's beliefs and practices, as well as perceptions on assessment. And from that, engaged in three teach and reflect cycles using the Assess Today short cycle observation protocol. So the teach and reflect cycles basically entailed me going into the classroom to observe Erica and document her use of formative assessment within the classroom. And then after observing Erica in the classroom setting, Erica and I debriefed and reflected on her use of formative assessment and any instructional adjustments that may or may not have been made, um, and how those connect to her beliefs and practices. Following that, there was a post interview looking into uh, the alignment of Erica's beliefs and practices over time. So once the data was collected, I then went into data analysis. So I started by organizing the data. So I transcribed and uploaded all of the transcripts to NVivo, which is a qualitative software program. And then from there, I conducted a first cycle coding for each data collection point separately. So I noted patterns using memos, and then I really coded using the cross-disciplinary framework. So some of that a priori codes came from there. Um, and I mapped those back onto the cross-disciplinary framework. So from there, I conducted a second cycle coding on the compiled data, where I was identifying additional codes, generated categories, generated themes, and then developed thematic statements. So the table to the right shows how I combined the data that I collected and mapped it onto the cross-disciplinary framework. I looked at the pre and post interviews, I looked at the teach and reflect cycles, and documented instances of where I could see those different components of habituation um, from Erica. And then I did the same thing with construction and the same thing with enculturation. So I was basically mapping everything onto the framework to see if there was alignment or not. And on top of that, I also looked at instances of formative assessment and if how she was assessing students aligned with the learning target. So the first major finding came from mapping all of that data onto the cross-disciplinary framework. So in table 3.4 to the left there, we can see the adaptation of the cross-disciplinary framework informed by data collection. So from the teach and reflect cycle 2, Erica was operating under the habituation learning metaphor, where students were mastering stoichiometric calculations, so they're mastering skills. Um, a lot of what we were seeing and discussing in the debrief came out of behaviorism. So there was a lot of repetition of specific mathematical steps. And the objective was really proficiency with these calculations. So being able to convert from moles to moles or convert from grams to grams. There's a lot of repetitive practice and a lot of practice problems. And Erica was able to assess if students mastered the skill through an individual practice problem at the end of class. And in Teach and Reflect Cycle 1, we had Erica operating under both a construction learning metaphor and an enculturation learning metaphor because there was more than one learning target. One of the learning targets for that specific Teach and Reflect cycle was concepts, where students were developing and revising knowledge about formal charge and resident structures, and ultimately the limitations of models. So there's a lot of pedagogy coming out of constructivism that we were seeing. So students were building their own knowledge and they were connecting mathematical models to physical models of chemical reactions. Also, there was enculturation within that, where students were obtaining certain dispositions, such as having a growth mindset, self confidence, and really taking ownership of constructing their knowledge. So, the learning theory there was out of sociocultural theory, and the learning environment was really shaped in a way that promoted collaboration and development of these dispositions. Second, educators can use assess today as an effective tool for reflecting on the congruence among learning targets, beliefs, practices, and assessments. So, providing a way for educators to debrief and reflect on their teaching, it allows them to really isolate what the learning target was, what instructional practices were used, and if that aligns with their personal beliefs, and as well as how they were assessing students meeting that learning target. Third, adding assessment and reflection to the cross disciplinary framework helped an educator alleviate feelings of disconnect between their beliefs and practices by identifying instances of misalignment and making instructional adjustments towards realignment. For Erica, she recognized the way she was assessing students at the end of the lesson was not congruent and did not match with her beliefs on what the purpose of assessment should be, as well as how she was assessing if students were meeting that learning target. So, for example, she would give them a homework assignment or a quick quiz question, having them practice problems. Uh, and she recognized that that didn't really give her insight into student understanding to the degree that she wanted. So she wanted to know more about how students were thinking about certain concepts, and if anything had changed within their thinking, like if they revised anything. So she recognized that in the future, she needs to add more time at the end of class for digging deeper into student thinking instead of just seeing if they had mastered a skill. So the implications of this research really impact multiple stakeholders. So we have secondary science educators as well as educational leaders and policymakers. So for secondary science educators, they can utilize Assess Today as a tool to analyze the congruence between their beliefs and practices to try to alleviate any feelings of disconnect that they might be having. So they can use Assess Today, go through these teach and reflect cycles, and really the debriefing allows that conversation to lead towards making these explicit connections between beliefs and practices. So when you map those components back onto the cross-disciplinary framework, there is a clear indication of if there is alignment or not. And for educational leaders and policymakers, um, I recommend that they think about shifting away from high stakes standardized testing um, and think more about the value that short cycle formative assessments can have as an accountability measure, or at least in conjunction with those tests. So having that more qualitative component provides an opportunity for conversation and reflection. So educators really can grow and make sure that their beliefs and practices are in alignment. I also think there would be value implementing this process into a professional learning community. And as a way to facilitate professional growth among educators. So allowing them to engage in this process and unpack the alignment among their learning targets, instructional practices, and assessments, I think would be invaluable. So educators are constantly reflecting on their practice and making sure that what they're doing is meaningful and in alignment. So I think distributing the findings to secondary science educators and secondary administrators is really important because these are the people that would actually be able to utilize this process and reflect on the alignment between beliefs and practices and get the most out of it. So I think a professional academic presentation um, would make the most sense. So either RCML or the National Science Teaching Association. But I think it would provide secondary science educators an opportunity to um, see how they can reflect on the alignment between their beliefs and practices, and how doing so can help them mitigate feelings of disconnect um, that might stem from a misalignment. And for administrators, it really gives them an opportunity to gain more insight into reasoning behind why educators are implementing certain instructional practices. And it provides a rich conversation surrounding educator growth through a detailed discussion. And these are my references. And I just want to take a second to say thank you to everybody who has been involved throughout this entire journey, um, friends, family, and especially the dissertation committee. Thank you for your time. And I appreciate all of you and all of your support. Thanks.